Chapter 37, the stormy 60s. We'll be talking about obviously the 1960s in this chapter. Let's start out talking about LBJ, who took over after the November 22nd, 1963 assassination of John F. Kennedy. His idol, LBJ's idol, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So you know that he's going to be liberal. You know he's going to be a supporter of the New Deal. So even though the New Deal was enacted, years and years before, he was a young politician at that time. He was very good with Congress. The Johnson treatment was for this big hulking Texan to come up to you and put his arm around you and tell you, you're going to vote my way, aren't you? He had a way with other senators, and he was a leader in the Senate, and people looked up to him. And, the Johnson treatment usually resulted in the other senator or congressman, House of Representative member, voting the way Johnson wanted him to vote. So as president, he was obviously liberal, helping pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned all racial discrimination in most private facilities open to the public, including theaters, hospitals, and restaurants. So this is 10 years after the really important Brown versus Topeka Board of Education desegregated schools. But now they're looking at desegregated other areas, not just schools. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did that. And LBJ helped pass that. He supported it. One of his endearing moments as president was the signing of the Civil Rights Act. This from a man from the South as well. So it's huge, huge at the time. There is the signing of that bill. It says here, the Civil Rights Act of 64 banned racial discrimination in most private facilities open to the public. It strengthened federal government's power to end segregation in schools and other public places. So it even went beyond Brown. It created the Federal Equal Opportunities Commission to oversee progress, and then also had stipulations in there, provisions for gender equality that lead to things like Title IX that give women athletes and women in other occupations more chances and opportunities. In 1964, not long after he became president, a year later, was an election. So less than a year later, he's going up against Republican Barry Goldwater, who was an ultra conservative who attacked Social Security, income tax, TVA, civil rights, and the Great Society, which was the LBJ's plan. He was very aggressive militarily and wanted to nuke Vietnam, basically. His aggressiveness scared people. And so LBJ wins this election in a landslide. And a lot of it was because of his support for JFK and the fond feelings that people had for JFK. So yeah, you can take a look at that. And it's a whole lot of Democrat domination in that election. All right, this was big when it comes to the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. There was an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of Vietnam. Supposedly a North Vietnamese ship fired on an American ship. We'll never know the exact circumstances behind this, but and Congress gave the president basically a blank check to do whatever he needs to do to control communism. All right, a blank check. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was Congress saying, do whatever you need to do, however much money it cost, however many troops it cost, go for it. So this Gulf of Tonkin resolution really activated the American response to the Vietnam conflict. It started, early in early 1960s when JFK sent what he called advisors over, and now it's just escalating. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolution really escalated the war in Vietnam. Okay, let's talk about LBJ's Great Society program. This is a really important slide here because it goes over all the different parts to his Great Society. So you had the New Deal, you had the Fair Deal, you have dynamic conservatism, and then you had the New Frontier with Kennedy, and now along comes LBJ's Great Society. And a big part of the Great Society was his war on poverty. The war on poverty was focused on Appalachia, right? It was like the poorest part of the country. I mean, it was FDR years before that said the poorest part of the country is Appalachia, and Johnson's going to reiterate that in 64. So he's going to pour a lot of money into that section of the country in the South. Also in the Great Society program was the creation of the Department of Transportation. And a lot of it had to do with making sure that transportation was done properly, making sure there was no discrimination on buses or trains or airplanes. Also created the Department of Housing and Urban Development to handle the situation going on, like, with white flight and the current situation at that time of the inner city, the bad atmosphere, the rundown inner city areas. So those two departments were new cabinet positions: Department of Transportation, Department of Housing and Urban Development. The Department of Housing and Urban Development was headed by Robert Weaver, who was the first Black cabinet secretary in the United States history. LBJ also wanted aid to education, medical aid for the elderly and indigent, and which was Medicare and Medicaid. So he really said, as a tribute to the fallen president, we should pass what he wanted, and that was Medicare and Medicaid and aid to education. And he got that done. We still have them today. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1969 abolished the quotas system in the United States, allowing more immigrants to enter into this country, and also started what's still around today, Project Head Start, which gives opportunity to underprivileged preschool children. Project Head Start allows kids that are pre-K to go to school, like it would be the equivalent of public preschool. Before Project Head Start, and even today, most preschools are private, and it costs a lot of money to send your kid to preschool. But that's getting people ahead, giving kids an opportunity and a head start before they actually go into kindergarten. And it's we've come to know that it's very important. So basically, LBJ created public preschool with his Project Head Start. We have a few Project Head Starts in Salinas currently. And then, of course, we know about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then just as important was the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that did away with poll taxes and all these roadblocks that were set up to prevent African Americans from voting. So the Voting Rights Act of 65 and Civil Rights Act of 64, huge in the Great Society. So very important slide with lots of information regarding LBJ's Great Society. In 1964, they called it Freedom Summers, where you had busloads of kids, both African American and white, going down to the South and demonstrating. And their mantra, their chant was, "We shall overcome." And they would sing that, they would chant that, "We shall overcome." And they'd go down there. There were voter registration drives. So they'd go down there, they'd get as many African Americans to sign up to vote as they possibly could. This is a horrific event in history. It was Mississippi Burning is a movie out there from, I think, the early 90s or something. And it talks about this. James Chaney, a Black man from Mississippi, and his white colleagues, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner of New York, were killed in 1964 while trying to register Black voters in the southern state of Mississippi. The FBI found their bodies 44 days later. Goodman and Schwerner were shot in the chest. Chaney was shot, but he was also beaten to the point that half the bones in his body were broken. So horrible incident. These men were going down there trying to, with the Freedom Summers of 64, going down on these voter registration drives. And that's what happened. On June 21st, 2005, 41 years to the day after the murders, Edgar Ray Killen was convicted of manslaughter in the 1964 slaying of the 3 civil rights workers and was later sentenced to 60 years in prison. He died recently in prison. Okay, the Selma to Montgomery March, another epic moment in the civil rights movement, huge. The Selma to Montgomery marches were 3 marches along the 54-mile stretch highway between Selma and Montgomery, Alabama. In 1965, 65 was the year that marked the political and emotional peak of the civil rights movement. They were the culmination of the voting rights movement in Selma, Alabama. And you could see how violent this became. And here is a picture of at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. the protesters, the marchers are approaching the end of the bridge right here. The march was led by John Lewis, who died a couple months ago recently, and the Reverend Hosea Williams of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They made it only as far as the Edmund Pettus Bridge, 6 blocks away. State troopers and the sheriff department, some mounted on horseback, awaited them. In the presence of the news media, the lawmen attacked the peaceful demonstrators with billy clubs, tear gas, and bullwhips. Brutal television images of the attack, which presented people with horrifying images of marchers left bloodied and severely injured, roused support for the United States civil rights movement. Amelia Boynton was beaten and gassed nearly to death. Her photo appeared on the front page of the newspapers and news magazines around the world. 17 marchers were hospitalized, leading to the naming of the day, Bloody Sunday. And here they are. This is John Williams right here. That he's the one that recently passed away. And they're coming off the bridge. And this is what this here. Oh, there's Martin Luther King there. And here's what they were met with. So looking down, this is what as they came down off the bridge, this is a picture taken from their perspective right here. You have all these police officers with billy clubs, and then they started throwing tear gas canisters. And this is Amelia Boynton right here. She was beaten almost to death. She did survive. And there's Amelia Boynton again there. Here was the 50th anniversary recently, and this is Amelia Boynton right here, and that's Barack Obama. We shall overcome was what they were chanting. Okay, so that was televised. People saw that all over the country. Millions of people watched what happened at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. LBJ saw it, and he was horrified by what he saw. He said, what happened in Selma concerned all Americans who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice, and we shall overcome. What a huge moment in the civil rights movement when a white president from a southern state of Texas with a Texas drawl accent came out and said, we shall overcome. That was big. That was big. The Voting Rights Act of 65 that was signed by LBJ in Mississippi, which had the largest Black minority of any state, only about 5% of the eligible Blacks were registered to vote. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation kept them from the polls. How about this? Mississippi law required the names of prospective Black registrants to be published for 2 weeks in a local newspaper, a device that virtually guaranteed economic reprisals and worse, sometimes a brick through their window, or going in and just terrorizing the homes of these people that would go out and vote. The 24th Amendment to the Constitution eliminated the poll tax in federal elections. All right, we talked in the last chapter about the Black Power movement, the Olympics in '68 with Tommie Smith and John Carlos. The Black Power movement, some examples like the Watts riots, Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, who was a leader of the Nation of Islam, the Black Panther Party from Oakland, Stokely Carmichael and SNCC becoming more violent, and then the mantra, burn, baby, burn. When this whole nonviolent thing wasn't working, they went to riots like the Watts riots, and burn, baby, burn was what they began to chant. And then, of course, the tragic death of Martin Luther King. Here's some pictures from the Watts riot in 1965. Malcolm X was formerly the leader of the Nation of Islam, and then turned the opposite way and went peaceful. The Nation of Islam was more militant. It says here in 1946, Malcolm X was convicted of burglary and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. While in prison, he was converted to the Black Muslim faith. After his release from prison in 1952, he moved to Chicago, where he met Elijah Muhammad, leader of the Nation of Islam. He changed his name to X, a custom among Muhammad's followers who considered their family names to have originated with white slaveholders. Malcolm rejected integration and racial equality and instead advocated Black power. In March 1964, Malcolm left the Nation of Islam and established his own religious organization, the Organization of Afro-American Unity. After a pilgrimage to Mecca, Malcolm rejected his former separatist beliefs and advocated world brotherhood. Malcolm now blamed racism on Western culture and urged African Americans to join with sympathetic whites to bring it to an end. Malcolm X was shot dead at a party meeting in Harlem in February of 1965. 3 Black Muslims were later convicted of the murder. So yeah, Malcolm X was originally militant and turned more towards the opposite and went more peaceful, like Martin Luther King, but then paid for that with his life. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale founded the Black Panther Party in Oakland in 1966 to protect Black neighborhoods from police brutality. Their radical philosophy quickly made them a lightning rod for police harassment. The Panthers advocated exemption from the draft and reparations for slavery. The group also demanded the release of all Black prisoners and encouraged African Americans to carry guns. At its peak, the Black Panther Party had 2,000 members and several chapters. Gun battles with police in California, New York, and Chicago led to the arrest of several prominent members, including Huey Newton. This picture was taken on the second day of Newton's trial in San Francisco in July of 1968. More information on the Black Panther Party. The tragic assassination of Martin Luther King in Memphis, Tennessee. Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. 1968 was an incredibly violent year in history. It was 6:01 p.m. on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, while preparing to lead a local march in support of the predominantly Black Memphis Sanitation Workers Union, who was on strike at the time. Friends inside the motel heard the shot fired and ran to the balcony to find King shot in the throat. He was pronounced dead at St. Joseph's Hospital at 7:05 p.m. 2 months after King's death, escaped convict James Earl Ray was captured at London's Heathrow Airport while trying to leave the UK on a false Canadian passport. Ray was quickly extradited to Tennessee and charged with King's murder, confessing to the assassination on March 10th, 1969, though he recanted his confession 3 days later. Later, Ray would be sentenced to a 99-year prison term. So horrific year, 1968, a lot of things going on. The scope of the Vietnam War just continued to widen and widen, and more men were sent over, causing more backlash and more anger and resentment in the United States. By 1968, more than 1.5 million troops were sent to Asia, $30 billion annually. And it was just just so much, a lot of issues back and forth here and there, as we'll talk about. Anti-war protests against the Vietnam War. The Doves were peace lovers. A lot of them were hippies, liberals. The War Hawks tended to be more conservative, and they supported the war, and they clashed. LBJ ordered the CIA to spy on domestic anti-war activists, and he encouraged the FBI to use its counterintelligence program against that peaceful movement. People were beginning to see that there was a credibility gap between what the government knew and what the people knew, and what the government was doing and what the knowledge that the public had about what they were doing. There was this credibility gap, meaning people didn't believe the government at the time. Here's some classic anti-war demonstrations that are well known. This guy looks like more a hippie, was putting daisies in the guns of the military police, MPs. And you had a Vietnamese monk burning himself to death in Saigon in October of 1963 to protest the war. He literally got out of that cab right there, doused himself in gasoline, lit the fire, and proceeded to sit there quietly without screaming until he burned himself to death. The new left now was the hippies at the time. A lot of them were baby boom generation. They're in their late 70s now. It was a radical political movement in the 60s and 70s, mostly comprised of college students. Strength in numbers. Remember, there was so many of them because of the baby boom. They were social activists. They believed in anti-draft. They were against the draft. They were pro-civil rights. They were anti-traditional values. They rebelled with sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and they opposed authority. The long word, anti-disestablishmentarianism was born. People who are against the establishment. The Tet Offensive. Again, this also is going to increase the number of troops in Vietnam. On the Vietnamese New Year's, Viet Cong attacked and initially won a major battle against the South Vietnamese. They attacked violently. Eventually, they were beaten back by the United States and the South Vietnamese forces, but the damage was done. 200,000 more men were sent to Vietnam because of the Tet Offensive, out of fear that this was going to be bigger. So the war continues to widen. This is a famous picture right here. You could, if you wanted to watch the video of it, you could see it online, where he actually shoots him in the head. This is on February 1st, 1968, during the Tet Offensive. General Ngoc Loan, director of the South Vietnamese National Police Force, executed a Viet Cong prisoner on the streets of Saigon, and he actually pulled the trigger. The election of 1968. LBJ's popularity was declining because of the Vietnam War, because of the protests everywhere. Johnson also saw a challenge from Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy, and he decided that he wasn't going to run. On March 31st, Johnson declared that he would stop sending troops to Vietnam and that he would not run in 68. One of the candidates to run was the odds-on favorite to be the Democrat nominee in the election of 1968 was Robert F. Kennedy, brother of JFK. And he was shot and killed after giving a speech in Los Angeles. He was the leading candidate in 1968. Once again, another assassination in 1968, a violent year 1968 was. The killer was a man by the name of Sirhan Sirhan. At about 12:15 a.m. on June 5th, 1968, Sirhan Sirhan shot presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Kennedy, who was leaving a campaign rally, was mortally wounded and died the next day. Kennedy's death came just 2 months after the assassination of Martin Luther King. Sirhan was an Arab who had emigrated to the United States in the 1950s and was reportedly disturbed by Kennedy's pro-Israel positions. After a 1969 trial lasting nearly 4 months, Sirhan was convicted and sentenced to death. That sentence was commuted to life in prison, and Sirhan has been in prison in California ever since. His repeated applications for parole have been denied. Sirhan still at one point was at Soledad prison. I think he's currently at San Quentin. This is all the anger from the death of Martin Luther King and the death of RFK resulted in, at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, violence every single day. It was ugly. Again, 1968 strikes, again, violent. In the end, in 1968, Richard Nixon ended up going against Hubert Humphrey, and the American Independent Party nominated George Wallace, who was a racist. His saying was segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. George Wallace was not shockingly really, shot, survived, but was paralyzed from the waist down. He severed his spinal cord, but he continued in politics all the way until the 2000s, early 2000s. He supposedly changed his ways and he was against segregation and saw the light and he wasn't a racist anymore. But in 1968, not that long ago, George Wallace was running as a presidential candidate and actually won in the Deep South. He won Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Richard Nixon ends up winning this election in 1968. LBJ's legacy, here's his legacy. It's large. Civil rights and his war on poverty was lasting legacy. That Great Society, war on poverty, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65. Vietnam's going to hurt him because of the hawks versus the doves. Inflation will hurt him as inflation is beginning to creep up. He returned to his ranch and died there in 1973.